or sorry, last week.
All right. Thank you so much, Diana. And thanks to Hope for making this happen. Only Hope could bring Mike and I back together in the same screen.
Right.
I apologize ahead of time. I will inadvertently call you Madrid, Mike, ambassador. So if anybody knows, Madrid always went by his last name, and it kind of gave us reverence for him. And today you'll find out why. Mike, you've been a formidable proponent of not just projecting what we want to believe about Latino voters. From any party's perspective, you've always wanted us to look at what was the truth. How do we really understand the Latino voter, not just in this state, but throughout the country? And so that's the bulk of what your book is about, is appreciating that the Latino vote has changed. And it's not that the Latino voters of 30 years ago have changed. It's that the voters of today look different. They have different experiences, come from different perspectives. It's very generational. And so we wanted to dive into that and what the parties are getting right or wrong, inadvertently or purposely, about that. So we do want to spend a lot of time on that. We want to talk about another one of your themes, just and we spent a lot of time actually with Hope audiences to talk about the poverty as being the primary driver of low civic engagement, and what you still see in those trends, and what we need to still appreciate that despite process changes in the meantime. But of course, we have to get to the Latinization or the Latinization, however you want to see it. I say it Latinization of America. And I got to tell you, Madrid, some of the best, beautiful writing you have ever done is in this book. And I love how you captured the whole flip side of machismo. Want to talk about, what you've been hearing and how you've been battling that, but you've captured some parts of our identity that I've never seen weave together so well. And so I want to hear about, if you were going to make that chapter book, what that would look like. But first, just to give you all on in the internet world a concept of Madrid, and get you curious enough to read this book. I got to tell you, it's like probably the only book you'll read that has a chapter starting with this sentence: I always had a knack for being a pain in the ass when I wanted to be. But in the same book, he has a whole chapter dedicated to his mother and grandmother. So, and it's all about, great fodder for political geeks like everybody on this in the audience. So it's an amazing spectrum. And I just, really proud that you have got this in print. It's, there's encyclopedias of experience and data that are behind this. But my first question to you is, given all of that, could this book have been written any sooner? What stars were in alignment that it's happening now?
I'm just humbled, Carrie. First, it's great to see you again. It's been so many years. Hope, it's an organization that has a near and dear place to my heart. I think a lot of people know my firm does a lot of data work with Hope because we're personally passionate about seeing more and more Latino representation and empowerment. And you have been involved, you and Helen and so many others, from the very beginning of building something that has become just a real force in California and the country. And so thank you for what you've done. And again, I think a very eloquent encapsulation of what I tried to put together here. The book, The Latino Century, is really try to capture a lot of what my 30 years of history has meant, but also designed to be looking forward to the next 30 years and what that's going to mean for us. And the question of whether it could have been written earlier is a really insightful one, as simplistic as it may sound. And I'm going to say no.
Right.
only because there's so much that I not only continue to learn as the story of our people unfolds, but that I'm better able to understand now in a way that I was not as, a young man starting out looking at the demographics that were about to happen in the early mid 1990s. And back then they were just graphs and numbers and charts of what was going to happen. And I very much wanted to be a part of that over my career. I wanted to, I wanted to not only tell the story and kind of try to explain it to the rest of the country, but I wanted to help shape it for our own people, for our own political leadership. And so much of what I was studying has come to pass, but so much more were things that I never could have imagined. And we're at this critical moment as a community where we are changing dramatically. And the question for this next generation of leadership now going forward is going to be, can we meet that moment? In many ways, that our generation, I'm older, Carrie, you haven't aged today, but those of us that remember Prop 187, Prop 187 was 30 years ago this year. So almost 40% of Latino voters were not alive during Prop 187. It's kind of painful to say for older folks like us, but they don't have no living memory of that profound moment in Latino politics. And the next 30 years is going to be defined by issues and politics completely and entirely different than what the last 30 years was. And so I wanted, sorry to be so wordy, but it's a great question. What I wanted to do is really write down a book that explained the trajectory of my story, because it covers so much of the data that I try to put in the book as a way to understand where this is all heading. And so that was I don't think it could have been written at any other time but now, or should not have been.
Thank you. So let's delve into the context of how voters have changed. And you lay this out very specifically of how they are responding to a Democrat message versus a Republican message, what that's all about. And you also go into very specific states. But if treating this as a primer of what do we need to understand about the Latino voter spectrum today, how do you help us get our head around it?
I think if there's a takeaway that I want people to understand is that Latinos, well, again, 38% of us, 38% of Latinos nationally voted in our first election in 2016 or more recently, which is an astonishing number of how young our community is, but how fast we are now coming onto the voter rolls. It's going to start happening exponentially now. 4 million new Latinos added to the voter rolls in the last 4 years. I mean, it's an astonishing pace, even by California's standards. When we saw this rapid growth, it's going to be even bigger nationally. And what I want people to understand is generational differences have always been a bigger demarcation, even than country of origin, for us on how our politics are and how they evolve. And the fastest growing group of Latino voters, where most of this exponential growth is happening, is with third generation and now a discernible fourth generation of Latinos. We can actually poll fourth generation Latino voters, which was never, we've never been able to do that before. And these voters, again, are very much prioritizing economic class, jobs, and affordability issues by a wide measure over the traditional immigration, race lens through which our community has traditionally been defined. And so in many ways, we are at this pivotal moment of moving from a race-conscious voting group to a class-conscious voting group. And it's having extraordinary impacts and challenges in our political establishment. But we're seeing it in voting booths. We're seeing it in voter registration. We're seeing this peculiar rightward shift when even Donald Trump is the president, and everyone's kind of going, how can this possibly be happening? the demographics kind of give us a really good primer, as you said, a good roadmap on why it's happening and where it's going.
So let's delve more into the generational differences. You mentioned the what voters were valuing, 20, 30, 25 years ago versus what a younger generation is valuing. What do you attribute that to?
Well, it's in some ways, this is a very typical American experience, immigrant experience. At the turn of the last century, early 1900s, you had the Italians, Greeks, Poles coming to this country, and they would, have very strong, specific political perspectives. Then their children would have different political perspectives, and their grandchildren would ultimately change out and become white, is essentially the way we talk about it. Keep in mind, the term white is largely an American phenomenon. If you're white in Europe, you say I'm French, or I'm Italian, or I'm Irish, or I'm Swedish. They don't just all say I'm white. I mean, they're beginning to say that a little bit now. Whiteness is really an American construct defined by what we're not, which is I'm not brown, I'm not African American, I'm not indigenous, I'm not Mexican. Those were the three, right? If you're not those, then you're white, essentially. What's happening now is by the third generation, about 2/3 of Latinos are identifying not just as racially white, which technically the term Hispanic is technically racially white, but they're saying that they prioritize that preference, that typical American preference, as opposed to their Latinidad or their Latino heritage.
Mm-hmm.
And that's complicated a little bit because we're so close to not only Mexico, but to most of the Latin American countries of origin.
Right.
One big difference is, when you were an Italian American kid 100 years ago, and you're 15 years old and you jumped on a ship and stowawayed in the engine room, coming to Ellis Island, you've heard all these stories. You were never going back to Italy. You were never going back. Now a lot of us go back for posadas every year. And because of our technology, we're getting cultural content continuously. There's a strong seamlessness in the border, which reinforces a very distinct and unique culture. And I argue, because we are going to be a non-white majority country in 8 years in America, in 8 years we'll be for the first time ever a non-white majority country, almost entirely due to Latino growth. The whole idea of the melting pot is an outdated concept. Americans are becoming more like Latinos than Latinos are becoming more like Americans. And you hear very often younger Latinos say things like, I'm a 200%er. I'm 100% American, but I'm 100% Mexican, or 100% Latino. That is not new in American history, but it's not something we've identified with for about 150 years in this country, when the whole idea of a melting pot came to be. Before that, it was very common to be like German and speak German in German towns and marry a German. The melting pot theory in the early 1900s changed all of that. Latinos are changing it again now in the 2020s, the early part of this century. And sorry if I'm getting off topic here a little bit, but as you know, I kind of get a little bit academic about all of this stuff. Latinos, kind of our superpower is the blended nature of our culture. We have interracial marriage rates above 50%. You're more likely to marry a non-Latino than a Latino.
Mm-hmm.
And that's with African Americans, it's with Asians, and it's with whites. So we have very high interracial marriage rates across the board, and that's creating a new cultural perspective that America's never experienced before. And it's not small, it's not niche, it's going to be most of the country soon.
So that's an identity. Now let's translate it to voting behavior.
Yeah.
What do we know about male versus female voting behavior for Latinos?
So Latinos, Latinas have the largest gender gap of any race or ethnicity in the country. Our women, by a much wider measure, are voting for the Democratic Party. Republicans, men are voting for Republicans, especially amongst, well, let me explain why that's happening. It's happening largely because we have the largest education divide of any race or ethnicity as well, meaning our women are going to colleges and universities at a rate much greater than our men are. And that gap is bigger than any other race or ethnic group. So when people say the future is Latina, the future really, really is Latina, just demographically, because women increasingly will hold not just positions in elected office, we'll talk about that in just a second, at higher rates than any other race or ethnic groups, but women, Latinas, will be in the C-suite. They will be the heads of nonprofits, the head of for-profits, the CEOs, cultural leaders, all of the institutions that we have where college degrees carry weight in terms of leadership. Latinas are going to be much better positioned than men are in 10, 15, 20 years, if that's not already happening. So most of the shift that is happening to the right is happening with US-born, English-speaking Hispanic men who are the fastest growing segment of the blue-collar workforce, and they're voting, and many ways they're culturally the same as white non-college educated workers. They're replacing them on the job site, the construction site, the energy patch, manufacturing, agricultural spaces, mining, forestry, fisheries. Everywhere where there's blue-collar workers, Latinos are taking over those jobs, and as they take those jobs, they're voting correspondingly. Meanwhile, again, women are going to college at a rate faster than our men are, and that education divide is very strongly correlated to party preferences.
So speaking of party preferences, what is it about the Republican Party or strategy that is attracting male voters? What is it about the Democratic Party that's holding on to Latinas?
Yeah. So the whole premise of the book is that neither of these parties are getting it right. But we'll jump into that. But I want to make the case that Republicans are getting a bigger share of the Latino vote despite their best efforts, not because of them. They're not. I don't believe they're doing anything right. In fact, I think they're doing a lot wrong. But they're on policies, especially in the industries I just mentioned, they are viewed as the protectors of those industries, and the Democrats are very much viewed as a threat to those industries. Right. For example, President Biden, saying he wants to basically get rid of the combustible engine. He wants to go to all electric vehicles. That disrupts a heck of a lot of unionized workforces that are increasingly Latino, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the Democratic Party's policy positions are viewed as an existential threat to blue-collar workers. Now, we can debate the policy and if that's right or if it's wrong. I'm not a policy expert. I'm a political expert, and I'm not just postulating this. What I'm saying is the voting patterns are telling us this. This is happening. It's not hypothetical. Working class voters have been leaving the Democratic Party for the better part of a decade. And as the working class becomes more Latino, Latinos are leaving the Democratic Party. And that's what I think one of the biggest struggles for people to understand is with where this is all heading. Is the Democratic Party is becoming more white. It's becoming less diverse. It's becoming more college educated and wealthier. And it's animated a lot more by cultural issues than economic concerns. Dobbs, for example, abortion rights, marriage equality, gun control, legalization of marijuana. Those are the issues, and especially here in California, you listen to our governor, for example, 90% of what he's talking about are cultural issues. 99%, I would say. He's running ads for abortion rights in Tennessee and Alabama and in Mississippi, right? That is what animates the Democratic Party today. What does not animate the Democratic Party are economic issues and these economic concerns, and it's why California specifically is falling so far behind with working class voters, and why the middle class, I would argue, is under such stress in California. And we can get into some, specific policy issues and politically how they work out, but it's very different than what you're seeing with the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, as I point out in the book, is actually stifled by Donald Trump's presence. If Donald Trump was not the nominee, Republicans would be doing far better. A lot of people think, well, what is it about Donald Trump that is attracting all these Latinos? It's nothing. I think he's actually holding back a bigger shift. When we look at the demographics and you look at the political outcomes of races like Ron DeSantis in Florida, Okay, well, maybe Florida's an outlier. Well, what about Greg Abbott in Texas? What about Doug Ducey in Arizona, last Republican governor? They all outperformed Donald Trump amongst Latino voters. And if you don't believe that, how about Brian Dolly, the sacrificial lamb who ran for governor against Gavin Newsom? He outperformed Donald Trump. Brian Dolly, by the way, a lot of people probably don't even know who Brian Dolly was. He was a Republican nominee who ran against Gavin Newsom in the re-election. He actually he had the best Republican performance in 25 years, except for Arnold Schwarzenegger, for obvious reasons. And the reason is because Latino voters have started to vote more Republican in California too. Long way to go. I'm not saying California is going to be competitive anytime soon, but we are seeing a very significant narrowing of the gap now.
So as I mentioned earlier, we've got all of this realization or acceptance of who the Latino vote, what the Latino vote actually represents and the challenges. I just wanted to make sure we really confirmed that this is not Latinos of X number of years ago leaving any particular party or joining any particular party. It's really about looking at the voters today and how are they influenced, what's the potential influence from either party?
Carrie, that's a really important question because what I'm pointing out from the data is exactly what you just said. I want everybody to be really clear on this. We're hearing a lot in today's environment from pundits and news stories about a racial realignment. I don't believe that that's happening, and I don't make the case in the book. There are not Democrats who are switching to Republicans, or there may be, but it's anecdotal. It's not a major realignment. What I'm talking about is the emergence of new voters that are coming online. Mm-hmm. And we really started to first see this around 2016 with Bernie Sanders' campaign. And let me explain this a little bit more. It might help people understand a little bit better. The two American politicians who dramatically outperformed polling expectations and conventional wisdom with Latinos were Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. They both, by wide margins, showed these pops with Latino voters that nobody was expecting. And the truth of the matter is, most of the messaging coming from both of these candidates were anti-establishment in their own parties. And that's what I believe very firmly that Latinos are responding to. There's a certain Latino populism, and it's political populism. It's not even necessarily economic populism. It's against the party establishments because our people don't see our face in leadership. They don't see a message that is resonating, and they don't see a place for them. Really, I don't think most of us don't feel at home in either party. For the moment, Democrats are winning a majority of the vote. I think they will continue to do so for a little bit longer. And I've changed that projection. 6 years ago when we were talking about these things, I would say it would never happen in our lifetime. Now we're looking at polling that shows Latinos almost at parity. Like it's happening so fast, it's hard to put a trend line on it. But we do know that it's happening, and we do know that's happening in very big numbers. But it correlates to your previous question, which is what are the Republicans doing right? I don't think they're doing anything right. I think that when both parties do wrong and aren't getting it, it's natural to see a smoothing out of the voters who aren't responding to either party and saying, well, it's basically a coin toss. They're kind of the same. Mm-hmm. I'm getting the same results either way, so it doesn't really matter who I vote for, except that maybe Donald Trump is more populist and he's anti-structure, he's anti-establishment, he's anti-party. So I might as well throw in with him because the system's not working for me anyway.
So let's take this a step further. When over the weekend, finally, I guess people are reading the book because they finally you're getting commentary on, well, this is just because Latinos are more machismo and religious reasons and so forth. How do you address that it is not about machismo and it very and what it's really all about?
It's funny because most of the Latinos who read the book are like, he's saying stuff we've all known. You talk to white progressives and they're like, oh, it's because you're getting disinformation in Spanish, or it's the rise of evangelical churches, or it's It's, machismo. It's all these other reasons that they can't understand that non-white people aren't behaving like the minorities that they expect. But let's unravel the machismo piece. And I'm not going to suggest that machismo doesn't exist. Of course it does. And I think in non-Latino culture, we'd call it toxic masculinity, I think is probably what it is. And of course it exists. The same way systemic racism, of course it exists. But what I wanted to do was take this subjective concept and apply it politically and find some evidence and data for it. And that's very hard to do with a cultural attribution. But the first question you have to ask yourself is, okay, if Latinos are moving, third generation younger Latinos are moving towards Donald Trump because of machismo, why were we not seeing that for the previous two generations over the last 40 or 50 years? Like, does it skip a generation? Is it like a recessive gene that kind of goes away for a while and then it pops up somewhere? And then I was like, okay, well, let's take a look at the political structure. Why in some of the most iconic races does a Gloria Molina beat an Arch Torres in 1982, right? In the first really big Latino race, and doesn't beat him small. She kicked his butt, right? So this is an iconic fight between these two, the most Latino district in America at the time, and she wins. And then I start looking at the racial and gender trajectory, and you realize, well, wait a second. In Sacramento, there's more Latinas than Latinos. We are electing women at rates far greater than any other racial or ethnic group. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's just a California thing. So go to Texas. And Texas is like 45, 55 men, 45, but still way better. I mean, the gender parity is almost, we're hitting 50, close to 50% compared to women that are at like 30, 32%. And then I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's weird. Let's go look at Florida. Same thing in Florida. I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's weird. Let's go to New Jersey. New Jersey is like 70% Latina. Go to Utah, and the two leaders of their minority party are both Latinas in Utah. And so you can look at metrics across the board. Latino voters elect women at far greater numbers than any other race or ethnicity by a pretty considerable margin. And to me, that's at least a very good data point that we look to women to lead us. And that doesn't shock me at all. To me, that's natural. I think we're a very maternally focused culture, very maternally focused. And then I do start talking about some of the subjective elements of that in the book too, but other things you can't quantify. But you could never have a female iconography being the imagery of the United States of America, right? We have the Uncle Sam. In Mexico and Latin America, it's the Virgen de Guadalupe. It's a woman. It's a female iconography that we revere. People will say, well, Statue of Liberty. Statue of Liberty was a gift from France 100 years after. There you go. There it is. Statue of Liberty. Somebody always says that. Statue of Liberty was a gift from France. We didn't think of that. They gave it to us. And so our iconography, the imagery is the masculine, as it is in most Western European, in most white cultures. It's paternally focused. It's patriarchal. It's more of the masculine. In our communities, it's not at all. But again, that's very subjective. We can debate that and have a good glass of wine and talk about whether that's true or not. What we can't debate is the outcomes of these elections, where we are electing women to lead us at a rate far greater than any other group in America.
You note in that particular chapter just how much women, the Latinas, are kind of the doers, the problem solvers. Yeah. They don't get into political office to solve problems. They're leading nonprofits. They're getting involved in their community, and they're actually making things happen. That is translating to political representation. But that's exactly how HOPE started with its Leadership Institute. It was a statewide network of nonprofit leaders. We couldn't say out loud that it was about electing more Latinas because funding-wise, we couldn't do that. But we were targeting a whole group of women for that strong leadership network. But we were also targeting women who were working for electeds, who were the primary targets to run for office. They're the most likely, I should say, right? Brilliant. So this book was around it would have helped a lot more with our justification at the
Well, I
time.
mean, you intuitively understood how it worked. And I think the nonprofit model is beautiful. One of the reasons where one of the instances where this really came into focus was with Jimmy Gomez when he was elected to Congress, or the assembly was one of those races. And there was like 16 women running in that field. And then Jimmy, there's like 16 Latinas. And you look at all of them, and most of them came from nonprofit backgrounds. They were actually doing stuff and creating organizations to solve problems. And they split up the vote because there were so many women in the field. And so Jimmy won. Nothing against Jimmy. I think Jimmy's great. But that was when I realized, wait a second, what we're seeing is there are women, in labor, a lot of our friends, there are women that are former Capitol staffers that take that traditional trajectory to the state legislature. Increasingly, I'm actually writing an op-ed piece on this, the face of the business community now. It's no longer old white dudes from Pete Wilson's administration or the Schwarzenegger administration. They're Latinas. Latinas control most of the business PAC money in California now. Think about that. The head of the realtors, the head of Uber and the gig economies, AT&T, energy, all up and down. It's Latinas. They are running the business community now. It's not just labor voices that we're hearing, and that to me is remarkable. But it's not surprising when you look at the data.
So you do mention that in the data, there's a indication that folks see Latinas as more collaborative, and we do promote that notion of the difference between male and female leadership. Definitely, there's not saying either is bad or good or better, but there is more propensity for collaboration, which is required in a good democracy. What I didn't see in your book, and I was trying to remember what the source was, but it was around 98, and the Institute started in 99, that Latinas were seen as able to represent the whole, whereas they saw a Latino that would probably only represent their people, their part of the community. And it must have been some exit polling. I don't know if it was from Fernando Guerra, but I don't know if that's ever popped up in your analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge believer that this cultural characteristic is probably going to be the most definitive piece of what transforms democracy and our system of government, frankly, the whole American political system. I also firmly believe I'm probably not the right person to do that, as strange as that may sound. And you probably never heard Mike Madrid say, I'm not the right person. I'm the right person to do everything. But like, I want women to write this story, this narrative. Like, there's so much data out there, and a lot of that points in an opposite direction. I think is pretty easily dispelled. Like it's overwhelming. Like and it's not only that we've never seen Latino data like this, we've never seen gender data like this in any group, ever. So it's like, we need to lean into that as a culture and community.
What, 30 years? Because 98 was the first time the LA Times factored in a Latinos as part of their polling. That was the first time ever.
It wasn't that long ago.
And now look at now you're with Simon and Schuster and have a publicist.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And that's where, like, I really wanted to, when I was considering writing this book, I wanted to write something that small in that niche because I think it's going to be huge. So if anybody is interested in writing that book, I mean, let me know, because I want to help you, because it is a story that is a very different narrative than what we are being told. And the data is overwhelming from my perspective. And like I said, when you look around the table, and the organizations that you have built, I love the way that you started out with it intuitively, because the data would say that's how you should start. You guys just got it and realized, let's contact the doers. And that's what it was, is let's change the community. Let's get a title, right? Which I think is more of a male oriented focus. And now here's where I'll lose the audience a little bit. There is also this notion that women are less kind of extreme and they're more centrist and collaborative. I'm not sure I believe that. And as more and more women take office, we are seeing women set sort of the parameters of the right and the left.
Mhm.
So like the Myra Floreses, and I write about this, and AOC, these are, you know, these are strident ideologues. Nobody questions their Latinidad. Nobody questions their, you know, their femininity and their approach. They're extremely different in their Latina backgrounds, but they're also much more combative than collaborative. I believe that. That again might be subjective, but I think most people would agree with that.
Right. We do have a couple questions I want to get to, and I know we have a hard stop at one because you got to jet off somewhere. Um, there's a question just to go into more clarification, what you see in the differences between first and second generation voter versus third and fourth.
Yeah.
And if I'll add to it that if the, you know, because you also mentioned in the book, you refer back to Naleo's work on the influence of the Latina or the mother, you know, specifically, you know, in the household for the rest of the voters. If we already seen a divergence between men and women, then what's the role of the female, the Latina voter at that point?
Well, so two different questions. One's gender, right? One's generational. Let me talk about the generation one because I think it is very important. We are going to one of the most profound things that happened when President Biden issued the executive order, the first one on asylum seekers. CBS comes out with a poll: 69% of Latinos support him. 70% of all Americans support him. There's no differential between where Latinos are at and where the average American is at on what has been characterized wrongly as a central issue, racial issue for our community. I'm not going to say that immigration and the plight of the undocumented isn't an extremely important issue. I know that it is for me. I have worked on these issues, advocating for 30 years. My kids have been through the Venaver program to go down and help migrants on the border. It's a very central moral issue for me. But as a political professional, the data is also very clear. It has never been a top 3, 4, 5 issue for us. But what is driven, especially from the Democratic Party and advocacy voices in the party, is that that it's a mobilizing issue. It's the issue that we frame as being under attack. And so we need to mobilize and organize. And the truth is, that has never really worked. It worked in 1996 and 1998, but between 1998 and 2016, 20 years, Latino voter turnout dropped. It plummeted to historic lows while Democrats were spending millions driving that message. Why was it not working? It was not working because it was becoming less and less relatable every year. And again, these are important issues. I'm not dismissing it. And I'm not, you know, again, there's nobody to the left of immigration than Mike Madrid. Nobody. I take a backseat to nobody. I'm not making a case for anti-immigration. I will make a heated, passionate case for way more immigration. But politically, it's clear what's happening here. And that is that voter opinion, Latino voter opinion, has changed. Two specific examples. In 1994, 2/3 of Latinos opposed Proposition 187. Multi-generational, everybody came together that were under attack. Now, 70% of Latinos support Biden's asylum restrictions and shutting down the border. Like, that's a massive change. And what's changing is younger third and fourth generation voters who don't feel that same affinity on that issue. And by the way, first and second generation issue voters didn't feel that strongly about the issue ever. It's kind of this fake narrative that's been drawn up, or at least overemphasized. I don't want to say it was fake, but it was dramatically overemphasized. And then what happens is the media picks it up because the media is trying to make a caricature of us. Well, what do Latinos care about? Every poll, every credible poll of Latinos in the past 30 years has always said the economy is the top issue. When have you ever seen either of the major parties talk about the economy in a Latino specific perspective? Never. You never have, ever on either side. And I've worked on both sides. So as you know, I'm a little bit passionate about this issue because I've been saying this at Hope too for the last 20 years. It's like, that's our issue. Our voters are telling us this is our issue. And so that again takes us, I guess, to the gender consideration, where I think the question was, what should the parties be doing or what should women be doing?
Well, what is, you've got this divergence of how Latinas versus Latinos are going, and yet we know the strong influence Latinas have.
Yeah.
So
I
it
think, yeah.
connect the dots for me on how this
Well,
works.
and I told this story to a group of Orange County executives this morning, actually, because Hope was one of the first groups. We were doing some work for Hope on New York representation on this report that
Yeah.
just came out. And I was talking about this education divergence. And I will never forget this, is when we presented the data, the first question that Helen asked is, well, what do we need to do to help our men? It's such a beautiful question, right? And that's a very Latina question, right? Which is, that's the right moral question to ask. But I don't think that would have happened if I said that in a group of white women. And I don't mean to be disparaging. I just mean culturally, they would probably be like, yeah, well, good. We're finally catching up and we're getting ahead. The first question Latinos ask is, and I think it's largely true for Latinos as well, is the value of my individual success is only valuable in the relation to everybody else's in the community's success. That's a defining characteristic of Latino culture. It's what use is it if I'm successful alone, if my family is falling behind or my neighborhood is falling behind? That's not the way the average Latino sees the world. And so my individual successes only make sense in the construct of everybody else's success. So what does that mean specifically? The first is, if we're going to have greater civic engagement broadly, it will start with the women female head of household. It's very matriarchal. What Naleo's studies showed was, if the female head of household votes, she will drag the men to go vote too and be like, this is something important. And the men will be like, okay, mom, nana, abuelita says it's important. Let's go vote, right? Will they do it on their own? At a much lower propensity. But I also believe that we are going to see that slippage anyway,
Right.
because as the numbers get bigger, you're going to see men voting less and women voting more, Latinas voting more and Hispanos voting less.
Okay. I don't know if you can do this in 30 seconds, but there's a curiosity about the role of labor and how it's influencing either party, or how it's playing into this dynamic of how male Latino voters are voting.
So Latinos have the lowest unionization rate of any race or ethnicity. We're the most likely to work in gig economies and service sector jobs that are not organized. So the influence of labor has been very instrumental for Latinos within the Democratic Party. Outside of it, I don't think it's made much difference at all. And one of the reasons my point is, there's this kind of mythology about labor unions and driving out the vote and the machine and all these precinct workers and all this stuff. Well, how do you explain declining voter turnout in Latino communities over the past 20 years if it's such a strong force? You and I have had this conversation before. And again, I'm not anti-labor. I work for labor unions. I've worked for the trades. I've worked for SEIU. I've done, it's not a partisan statement. It's a data-driven demographic statement. And the answer, by the way, this is, I think, one of the Democratic Party's biggest problems, is they think that greater unionization is a solution to the workforce, the blue collar worker problem that they have. It's not. Blue collar workers, they don't see unions as the solution to their problems. They're looking, and I'm not saying it isn't or it's not. I'm not making that policy judgment. I'm saying this is the perspective of blue collar workers. They're not looking for that as a solution. And so the Democratic Party is going to have to come up with a much broader policy framework to engage these workers where they live with what they want to see. And the fact that they're not is why they're losing so many voters.
Thanks, Mike. My last question,
Yeah.
and then I'll hand it off to Diana, is what was it like to interview your mother for this book? And what does she think about all this that her son has gotten into?
That's why are you asking these questions? You're gonna make me tear up here. It was beautiful to hear my mom's perspective on stories about her mom.
Mhm.
You know, and I talk about this in the book. My abuelita came from Sonora. She came at 15. My illiterate. My grandfather was 32. She knew nobody. She knew nobody. She did not speak the language. She couldn't write. And she comes from the hills of Sonora to to the urban core of Los Angeles. And I can't imagine how that impacts somebody.
Mhm.
And so the plight of the immigrant is something that's very deeply personal and profound for me. And I think hearing her talk about her mother, I think, and watching her understand the trajectory of our family history from knowing that and seeing her mom to what her son is now doing, and her grandchildren are voting age now too. I mean, my youngest is 21 years old. My kids are fourth generation. So, you know, and I think seeing the story written in data and our personal family story and all of it making sense. And my hope is that's what Latinos will see in the book is what Mike is saying from a data perspective. If I overlay that with my family history, I can see what he's saying. And that's why I approached the book the way I did. But thank you for that beautiful question.
Of course, and it made a fascinating book, a truly beautiful story, and captivating read. So thank you for, I know that took a lot of courage and vulnerability because you never insert yourself in the actual political story, but this made it real. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Carrie, for moderating this conversation. Mike, thank you for being here with us today. Again, I'm Diana Mai. I'm the Director of Programs here at Hope. Thank you all for being with us this last hour. I wanted to quickly acknowledge Rosario Marin, who is here with us, and Liz Atley from our board. Thank you for being here. And to reiterate, this is the first of a series. The next one will be July 17th, and we'll be talking about wellness and how gratitude impacts leadership. So hopefully you can join us all for that. And with that, I say thank you. Quick plug. Oh, Mike, there was a question about whether you have another book signing in Sacramento. So I want to make sure we get that out. And then also want to plug that Mike is really funny on Twitter. So you should follow him there.
Now, my mother does not follow me on Twitter, so thank goodness. There will be more Sacramento events slated. They have not been set yet, but I will let Hope know, and you can let people know. I'll be doing something in Santa Cruz on July 8th. I'll be doing a lot more in Orange County and in Los Angeles going through the summer into September. But I'll let you guys know, and if you could communicate it, that would be great.
And we want to see the art book come out next too.
Yeah, this is the cover of the book. This is one of my paintings.
I know.
So yeah.
And the little girl is the one that reminds me of all your work. So.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Well,
Hope, I love you
both.
guys. I appreciate everything that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias. Bye.
Bye.